Hey, I'm Andrew Chapman. I'm here today with my friend Ryan Jenkins, who is a professor of philosophy at Poly San Luis Obispo. He studies and lectures on and publishes papers and books about philosophy of technology and related ethical issues. And Ryan, why don't you introduce yourself?
I cut my teeth thinking about cyber warfare as a graduate student, trained in applied ethics. From there, I started studying military ethics, autonomous weapons, killer robots, autonomous cars, and now I've been thinking more about technology generally, autonomy, artificial intelligence more generally, and the kinds of problems it raises and the questions that it raises for society.
You and I wanted to talk today about the issue of moral realism, the position that's known as moral or ethical realism. And I just wanted to note that sometimes people use the words moral and ethical in different ways, and you and I are going to be using them to be roughly synonymous with each other. Can you tell me what this position of moral realism is in just a couple of sentences?
Yeah, moral realism is the view that there are moral facts that are objective, and they have exactly the same status as natural facts about the world or other empirical facts that are uncontroversial. So if it's true that murder is wrong, it's true in exactly the same way that it's true that man walked on the moon in 1969. It's a fact about the way the world is. I guess it's a separate question how we would investigate it and how we would establish that fact. But it's true, it's objective, it's independent of what you believe, and moreover, it has implications for the way that we ought to behave.
You and I have students who I think are nervous about the position of moral realism, and they're nervous about it for a lot of reasons that may not be fully articulable to them, but we've heard a lot of these issues that they've had so many times. What's one of the reasons that students might be nervous about the position of moral realism, where they're not nervous about the position that there are facts about the moon and when we walked on it?
Yeah, I think that, and this reason is probably never articulated, but I think that this is a worry that a lot of students have. I think that the position is hugely intimidating, because if it's true, then it means that it's possible that you and people that you care about and everyone that you know are behaving in ways that are wrong, that open you up to criticism, that you have to change not only what you believe, but the way that you behave, and those kinds of changes are costly and frightening, and it also requires coming to grips with the fact that you might have been a bad person. Even if you were accidentally a bad person, you've been behaving in ways that are wrong up until now. And that's frightening. People don't like being criticized. And I think that moral realism is a precondition for serious moral criticism in their eyes. If it's true, it opens the door to a lot of uncomfortable thoughts or uncomfortable claims that they're going to be confronted with.
Now, the way that you're talking sounds like a denial of a sort of liberal individualism that we in the West have come to prize, that the way that I live my life, so long as it doesn't directly impact the way that you live your life, should be of no concern to you, and similarly, the way that you live your life should be of no concern to me. We, as a society that prizes tolerance and diversity of belief, should just let 1,000 flowers bloom, and no matter how people want to live their lives, so long as they're doing it on their own, that is not an issue for appraisal or analysis or condemnation. So is what you're saying that picture, that liberal Western picture of letting 1,000 flowers bloom would be wrong if moral realism is true?
Oh, I think there's an irony there, which is that view itself seems to presume a kind of moral realism. That it is, as a matter of fact, true that if I'm living my life in a way that doesn't affect you, you have no grounds to criticize me, or it would be uncouth to criticize me. But if you believe that, you seem to be devoted already to a kind of realism.
Okay, so even in order to make the claim that many of us take to be foundational to our tolerant way of life, that many different ways of living are valuable, that on its own is a moral claim. And if it's true that many different ways of living are valuable, then it is objectively, morally true that many different ways of living are valuable, and so moral realism is already true.
Yeah. Some people, if they say something like, well, I just think that everyone should tolerate everyone else, well, then you have a view that there's some moral truth that's incumbent upon everyone that generates reasons for them in the way that they behave, and if they're intolerant, it gives you legitimate grounds to criticize them. I mean, those are all the kinds of things that realists would believe.
So we've talked about what the position of moral realism is, and we've talked about why some people might be nervous initially about moral realism because it opens them and their friends and their family and their lifestyle up to criticism. And we've also talked about how this knee-jerk reaction that moral realism is intolerant is in fact already a presumption of moral realism. So let's get into a direct argument in favor of moral realism. And this is an argument that both you and I think is a strong argument. It's not impossible to get around this, but it's something that we think that people who are learning about morality or who are nervous about moral realism should take as really strong evidence in favor of moral realism. This is the argument that's known as the argument from disagreement. So can you tell me a little bit about what that argument says and why it should give me reason to be a moral realist?
So the argument from disagreement says, why don't you really reflect on the way that you and the way that other people in society have disagreements about moral claims? And if moral realism is true, it can explain why people care so deeply about moral matters in the way that they don't get into shouting arguments about other things. If moral realism is false, then this behavior becomes perplexing, and all of these ways that we commonly disagree about morality become totally nonsensical. There's just no there if realism is false, and it ultimately ought not matter whether abortion is legal or illegal, because there's just no fact of the matter about whether it's good or bad. But when you see two people get in shouting arguments, and when you see people kill each other over questions of morality, questions like abortion, for example, is a hot-button one in America, what it seems to reveal is that they do really think there's something at issue that ultimately matters. They think that there's some question that needs to be settled. They don't think it's a matter of opinion, because we don't shout at each other and we don't assault each other talking about which flavor of ice cream is best. When people have disagreements about morality, it seems consistent with moral realism, and it seems inconsistent with anti-realism or other views that would deny the reality of moral facts.
So let me know if this is another way of saying exactly what you just said, but coming from the opposite direction. We see in the world that people disagree with each other about moral issues, and we disagree with other people about moral issues. If we think that abortion is okay, then we think that people who say that it's not okay are wrong. And if we think that personal gun ownership is a bad thing, then we think that people who disagree with us are wrong. And so there's this phenomenon of disagreement about moral issues in the world. We see it between other people, we see it in our own lives, but that sort of disagreement only makes sense if there's something that we can be disagreeing about. If there's no fact of the matter over which we can be disagreeing, then there is no such thing as disagreement. So the phenomenon can only be, well, I guess it could be explained in two ways. It could be explained as just massive confusion on our part, but presuming that humans at least sometimes get it right in their disagreement with other people, it can best be explained by the fact that there are legitimate moral facts over which we are disagreeing and about which we're trying to discover the reality of. We're trying to discover what they actually are.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And we should also be careful to disentangle this claim from some other claims. Like the question of whether abortion is moral or immoral is separate from the question of the appropriate government policy towards abortion. It's totally separate from the question of whether there's a heaven or hell, and whether fetuses have souls or whether they have a right to life. Like all of those questions we can set aside. So, and it's even separate from the question whether it ought to be a quote-unquote personal choice, whether the government can coerce you into having an abortion or not. Like all of those questions are separate, and I want to be clear that we're not trying to touch on all of those things. But the summary that you gave is a good one.
So the issue of morality is just an issue about what's right and wrong, and these other issues, while they might be related to issues of morality, maybe a government wants to make the most moral position, or maybe if God exists, God would want you to do the most morally righteous thing. Those are subsidiary issues, or are things over and above just the moral question.
Yeah. So I have in mind here someone that thinks, like, someone who's listening to this and thinks, well, abortion is just a personal choice. And I think a lot of people have that view, but I actually think that view also reveals some other moral commitments, some commitments to objective moral facts. For example, that it's inappropriate or callous to criticize someone for having an abortion. If you believe that, then you believe that there's an objective moral fact, because the people who are criticizing you probably also believe that they're doing the right thing. And if there were no fact of the matter, then both of you would be right, or you would be mistaken to think that they were doing something that was wrong.
There seems to be this worry that some people have about claiming that there are moral facts, that this is claiming that we have all of the knowledge about morality and that we're claiming that the way we see things is better than the way that other people see things, and maybe even that therefore we're in a position to forcibly prevent people from acting certain ways or to coerce them violently into acting certain ways. Is that worry founded in the way that we do act, or is it founded in philosophical practice? Should we be worried that a moral objectivist view like the one that we're talking about gives rise to that sort of certainty and arrogance and violent intimidation of other people?
Well, it certainly doesn't have to. Of course, it's a dangerous view to have, to think that you have a monopoly on the moral truth. Because that very easily slides into the view that you're then justified in coercing other people to do what you think is best. So there's some, I guess, a contingent historical connection between those two views. People who have thought that they had a monopoly on the moral truth have often also thought that they were justified in enforcing it on others. But there's no necessary connection between those two things. And if anything, I think one of the benefits of studying philosophy is that it's a great source of humility. We have to acknowledge the possibility of objective moral truth before these investigations even make sense. And what they reveal is that there's a tremendous amount of disagreement about morality, even among the experts, and there are impressive and sophisticated arguments on all sides.
And so I just want to end by picking up on something you said just a minute ago, that philosophy is helpful in making clear to us ways that we can think about things that we already believe. And it seems like, given what you said, that most of the world interacts as if they already believe that moral realism is true. And so if most of the world already acts as though they believe that moral realism is true, then the benefit of studying philosophy for those people is what?
The benefit of studying philosophy for those people is to help them realize the full menu of alternatives and the arguments that have been given about substantive moral views. For one thing, it's important to realize that you're acting inconsistently if you engage in disagreements in all these ways and yet deny that moral realism is true. So that's one benefit that you can have just by considering the conflict between your beliefs and your behavior. Once you've gotten that far, you ought to realize, oh, there's very fruitful discussions that have been taking place over the last 2,000 or 2,500 years. Now that I understand that morality is a real thing, that I can discover some truths about, or that I can become more clear about, I ought to investigate the full range of alternatives that have been presented to me. Maybe I'll learn something. Maybe I'll realize something new that's attractive and that I think is quite plausible. And maybe I'll be encouraged or invigorated to have an impact on the world that I hadn't realized before.
And so the way that you're putting it, philosophy enables us to be better at the sort of things that we're all already doing. It allows us to have more freedom of choice in the positions that we believe and that we advocate for and that we structure our lives around. It's not about changing our minds about who we think we are as people, but about making us better in terms of the people that we already think we are.
Yeah. That's excellent. And there's an old philosophical tradition that goes back to Socrates that says that being in ignorance is actually one of the worst conditions that you can be in. And being led out of ignorance towards education or towards knowledge about the options that you have and engaging in a sincere reflection on the beliefs that you have and the way that you ought to behave is a crucial element of a well-lived human life. And I think that that kind of study can begin with the realization about moral realism and the importance that it has to your life.
Well, Ryan Jenkins, thanks for talking to me. I see that your autonomous car just arrived outside, so thanks a lot, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Always a pleasure.